On the 3rd of February 1959, a small charter plane took off near Clear Lake, Iowa, on its way to Moorhead, Minnesota. The plane carried only 3 passengers: Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, who were on the Winter Dance Party tour. Within minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed, killing all 4 of the men immediately on impact. This day came to be known as the day the music died. Nearly 5 decades later, cinema would experience a moment that, while very different in circumstance, invites a similar kind of reflection. For on the 30th of July 2007, 2 directors, Ingmar Bergman and Michelangelo Antonioni, both passed away in what can be described as a cultural irony and marking a significant and symbolic moment in film history. These 2 giants of cinema were not just great directors, they both, in similar and differing ways, represent a type of cinema that emerged in the middle part of the 20th century. A cinema characterized by existentialism, faith, ambiguity, and psychologically demanding filmmaking. Join me on this journey for what is both a tribute and an exploration of how these 2 bright lights of cinema shaped this tradition and how their simultaneous departure from this world represents a shift in filmmaking. A moment that in retrospect might be understood as the day cinema died. Before talking about how this type of filmmaking has faded as we move further through the 21st century, we must first define what type of cinema we are talking about. I would refer to it as existential cinema, but it relates to the description laid out by the great screenwriter and director Paul Schrader, who identified a type of cinema which he called the transcendental type. He said, "Transcendental style seeks to maximize the mystery of existence. It eschews all conventional interpretation of reality: realism, naturalism, psychologism, romanticism, expressionism, impressionism, and finally, rationalism. To the transcendental artist, rationalism is only one of many approaches to life, not an imperative." His exemplars of this style, which he outlines in his book, are Ozu from the Eastern tradition and Bresson from the Western one. However, Bergman and Antonioni emerge as 2 examples that exist who embody both the style elucidated by Schrader, as well as a more inclusive one, which I'll explore through 2 of their best known works. So where do we see this in the case of Antonioni? His landmark film, and one which he's perhaps most known for, is his film L'Avventura, or The Adventure, in 1960. The film follows the story of the disappearance of a young woman during a boating trip and the attempt by her best friend and her lover to find her. Its opening at the 1960 Cannes Film Festival is perhaps the most famous in the festival's history, garnering laughter in the theatre at the beginning of the picture, which evolved eventually into boos from the audience. Despite that, however, the next day, Antonioni and the rest of the filmmakers involved were sent a letter of admiration from established directors and writers, commending them for what they considered the best film screen at the festival. And then after a second screening, it went on to win the jury prize. Its initial reception is highly telling, for it indicates that the audience were not prepared for the film. It was clearly a rather radical shift in what had come previously. And you need only watch L'Avventura once to realise what it is I'm actually talking about. Superficially speaking, it's really slow, somewhat dull, and practically nothing happens from the point of view of the plot. But because of these superficial reasons which incited laughter and booing from its first audience, they're precisely the reasons that L'Avventura becomes so fascinating and pivotal in cinema once we look beyond that surface. All of a sudden, action in film becomes incidental.
Антониони, certo. Потому что в свое время Антониони на меня произвел неизгладимое впечатление своими картинами и в большей степени приключением. И мне представляется картина чрезвычайно интересной. И там я понял, глядя этот фильм, что действие, понятие действия в кино весьма условно. Практически у Антониони в фильмах ничего не происходит. И это и есть смысл действий в фильмах Антониони.
Almost nothing actually happens in the film at all. So much so that the condensed synopsis I've already provided more or less actually captures the actual physical action that takes place in the film. And in stripping back what is ordinarily the primary vehicle for a film, what we would call the plot, What's left is something more akin to the art of music, which is an experiential event shaped by composition, rhythm, tone, and the relationships that the characters have to themselves, each other, and how this is actually expressed through the space and time in frame. What's more is that the actors themselves are used in a wholly different way than is traditionally understood. As Antonioni himself stated, the actor is an element in the image. A modification of his pose or gestures is a modification of the image itself. Antonioni seems far more concerned with the emotional role that the actor plays within the frame itself, rather than the internal psychological or emotional state of the character. He's eliciting an emotional state from us, the audience, using the elements at his disposal, much like a painter might. So the placement of the actor in the frame, the silence of the scene, or even the display and the richness of the colour that we see in his later films. Take a character who's expressing deep sadness. We might expect a director to cut into a close-up to reveal the emotional state of the character, whereas Antonioni would instead choose to pull back to a wide and let the entire frame express the emotion, such as loneliness or alienation. Well, let's take another example, the typical shot reverse shot structure for almost any dialogue scene in a film. Antonioni would rarely use this because this is strictly a functional way to cover a conversation between two characters. And moreover, it's, in his mind, a missed opportunity to express a relationship between either the characters, the landscape, or evoke a particular feeling from the audience. What Antonioni offers us through his films is not only the catharsis experience by identifying with the character journey, the film as a whole is itself an experience and the chance to ponder through an aesthetic experience life as meaningful. Even if the characters are broken, downtrodden, and left no better at the end of the picture, we as an audience experience the beauty of viewing this episode, and in that experience, meaning is no longer something the film explains, but something we momentarily feel. Bergman was, of course, a contemporary of Antonioni, and the similarities between these two were just as interesting as the differences. Bergman was highly prolific, and there are many of his works which rank as some of the best cinema of the 20th century, including The Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, and Cries and Whispers. However, the film that we are concerned with for this video is Persona. The film follows Elizabeth, an actress who suddenly and inexplicably stops speaking and withdraws into silence. After being taken under the care of a nurse, Alma, the boundary between the two women begin to blur as Alma shares with increasing intimacy her thoughts, fears, and memories. Beginning first with the similarities. Like Antonioni, Bergman also treats the film as a whole as an experience for the audience. There's a stripping back of the filmic elements to move away from spectacle, using silence, slow pacing, and minimalism to transcend the image. Like L'Avventura, there is very little that actually happens from the point of view of action, instead using the aforementioned elements to construct an aesthetic experience for the audience. Also like Antonioni, there is an ambiguity to the ending, offering us no psychological resolution for the characters, so much associated with the Hollywood picture, instead leaving it open-ended for the audience to ponder. But where Antonioni elicited emotion by distancing us from the characters, Bergman does so by confronting us with their inner world, creating an intimacy which is displayed throughout his entire body of work. It should be noted that in Sweden, Bergman was just as well known for his directing in the theatre as he was in film. So the way that he approached performance and acting was wholly different to the way Antonioni used actors in his films. And this is demonstrated so powerfully in Persona. The viewer's experience of Alma's internal struggle is merged with Elizabeth's, and the two literally collapse into one another in the famous shot from the film. And in doing so, we as viewers become associated with the inner world of these two characters. This is radically different to how Antonioni operates with actors, where we are held at a distance from the characters, often described as alienation by critics. What's also fascinating about these two films is the meta plane that they operate on, though conducted in separate ways. In Persona, we are reminded at pivotal sections of the film, including the opening, which has been endlessly studied in film circles, that we are actually watching a construction of reality, a moving picture. So much of cinema is geared towards having us suspend this awareness, usually through what is called continuity editing as an example, so that the action of the film is seamless and non-disruptive. Bergman, however, creates a dialogue with the audience by breaking the fourth wall, the legacy which can be seen in such films as Woody Allen's Annie Hall. Antonioni also makes us aware we are watching a film, but in a much more subtle way, with composition, the unusually long duration of shots, a frame lingering for longer than we're used to, forcing us to question what the director is aiming to show us or have us feel from that. Through the groundbreaking work of Persona, Bergman invites viewers into an emotional confrontation with the characters. For you don't just simply watch, you can't help but recognize yourself. Now returning to how we began the conversation, with the question of how cinemas change from the departure of these two great directors. We owe much to both Bergman and Antonioni for what they gave to cinema, not only directly through the myriad of films that they created, but also by the self-conscious and even unconscious influence felt by filmmakers to follow, such as Tarkovsky, Lynch, Kubrick, Scorsese, and Wong Kar-wai, just to name a few. And the ironic synchronization of their deaths does not literally mean that cinema is dead, for there has been and will continue to be a number of great films that continue in their legacy. But as we move farther away from the epoch in which these two dominated cinema and continue with wonderful technological advances that make the ability to create a film more accessible each and every day, there is a growing concern that we are losing a type of cinema that treats film not as something to be understood, but something to experience. Bergman said it best as he paraphrased Antonioni.
Jag vet Antonioni sa vid något tillfälle någonting väldigt bra. Han sa det att film är ett märkvärdigt medium på det sättet att har man någonting att säga så kan man säga det med film egentligen, och man kan vara hur klantig som helst. Klantig kanske han inte sa, men du förstår vad jag menar. Mm. Och han var ju inte någon tekniker, Antonioni, det ska Gud veta. Men han fick ju saker och ting sagda. De här nu som kommer, de är så otroligt skickliga, de här unga regissörerna som kommer. De kan hela jobbet, men det är inte så ofta som de har någonting riktigt att säga.